A young billionaire rescues a pair of twin sisters from an aggressive man on the street and offers them shelter in his penthouse. But when he returns from work the next day, he's shocked by what he finds. The piercing sound of a car horn cut through the night air in Manhattan, causing Thomas Carter to start. His once confident and determined steps faltered for an instant on the crowded sidewalk. The 30-year-old billionaire adjusted his silk tie, an automatic gesture that betrayed his restlessness. His eyes, usually sharp for business opportunities, now wandered distractedly over the lights of the city that never sleeps. The day had been hellish. Endless meetings, crucial decisions, millions at stake. Thomas felt the weight of every second, every choice, pressing down on his broad shoulders beneath the custom-tailored Italian suit. He needed this walk, this momentary escape from the corporate world he had built with such effort. That's when he heard it. A high-pitched, desperate scream that stood out even amid the urban chaos. Thomas turned sharply, his heightened instincts honing in on the source of the sound. The scene unfolding just a few feet away was enough to freeze the blood. A burly man, unshaven and with bloodshot eyes, was yelling at two little girls. The twins, who seemed no older than 4, cowered at each word, their small hands clinging to each other as if their lives depended on it. "You useless brats!" the man shouted, his breath visibly reeking of alcohol. "Can't do anything right." The world around Thomas vanished. Suddenly, he wasn't the powerful CEO anymore. He was an 8-year-old boy again, cowering in the corner of a dark room, his own father's screams echoing off the thin walls of the rundown apartment where he grew up. "Thomas, you idiot, you're good for nothing. I should have drowned you when you were born." The flashback was so vivid that Thomas could practically smell the musty odor and cheap beer that filled his childhood memories. His heart hammered in his chest, and his palms grew clammy. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, but then something inside him snapped. Without a second thought, Thomas strode across the street with long, determined steps. His voice, usually reserved for closing multi-million-dollar deals, now thundered with an authority that made the bystanders stop in their tracks. "Hey, you!" Thomas roared, positioning himself between the man and the girls. "Back away from them." Now, the man, whom Thomas assumed to be the girl's stepfather, staggered back, startled by the sudden intervention. His eyes, clouded by booze, focused on Thomas, and a crooked, threatening grin formed on his lips. "Who do you think you are, you stuck-up pretty boy?" the man growled, introducing himself as Victor. "This is none of your business. Get lost before I smash that handsome face of yours." Thomas caught a whiff of cheap alcohol and sweat radiating from Victor. For a moment, he saw his own father in this pathetic man before him, but this time he was no longer a defenseless child. He was Thomas Carter, and he was about to change the course of several lives. "These girls," Thomas said, his voice calm but laced with a veiled threat, "are under my protection now. Take one more step toward them, and I'll personally make sure you spend the rest of your miserable days behind bars." Victor hesitated for a moment, his gaze flickering between Thomas and the girls. Then, in a movement that was surprisingly quick for someone so drunk, he lunged, fists clenched. Thomas didn't move. His eyes, cold as steel, locked onto Victor's. There was something in that stare, a mix of power, determination, and a hint of madness, that stopped Victor in his tracks. "You have no idea who I am or what I'm capable of," Thomas said, his voice low and dangerous. "But if you lay a finger on these girls, I promise you'll find out the hard way." Time seemed to freeze. The onlookers gawked, phones in hand, ready to record what was sure to become the next viral video. It was at that moment that Thomas made a decision that would change his life forever. Turning to the twins, who watched him with a mix of fear and hope, he knelt down to their eye level. "Hi," he said gently, his tone completely different from the one he had used with Victor. "My name is Thomas. Would you like to come with me? I promise you'll be safe." The girls exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Then, almost in unison, they reached out their small hands to Thomas. Victor, realizing he was losing control of the situation, lurched forward again. "You're not going anywhere, you little—" But Thomas was already on his feet, the girls protected behind him. In one swift movement, He pulled his phone from his pocket. "Anne," he said as soon as the call connected, "I need security and a car right now, and get in touch with our lawyers. We have a situation." Turning to Victor one last time, Thomas spoke, his voice filled with a dark promise. "This isn't over. You will pay for every tear these girls have shed." With that, Thomas guided the twins away from Victor, who was now hurling incoherent threats. Within minutes, a sleek black car pulled up beside them. Thomas helped the girls into it, casting one final glare at Victor, who was now being held back by two men in suits, Thomas's security team. As the car pulled away, carrying them toward an uncertain future, Thomas looked at the two small figures huddled on the seat next to him. Their hearts beat in unison, a symphony of fear, hope, and endless possibilities. The private elevator glided silently toward Thomas Carter's luxurious penthouse. Next to him, the twins, Sophie and Claire, stood motionless, their tiny hands still clasped together. Thomas observed the girls in the reflection of the elevator doors, noticing their distant gazes and tense shoulders. The contrast between the opulent surroundings and the two frightened children couldn't have been more striking. When the doors opened, revealing an elegant entryway, Thomas hesitated for a moment. "Welcome to my home," he said softly, trying not to frighten them any further. "You're safe here." The girls didn't respond. They simply followed Thomas as he guided them inside. The vast space, with modern furniture and expensive artwork, seemed to swallow the twins' small figures. Thomas noticed how their eyes widened, absorbing each detail of this luxurious environment, so different from what they were used to. Thomas led them to the living room sofa, an enormous piece of Italian leather. "Why don't you sit here? I'll get you something to drink." The girls obeyed silently, their small bodies almost disappearing into the oversized couch. In the kitchen, Thomas found himself paralyzed in front of the open refrigerator. What do 4-year-olds drink? Juice, milk, water. He had never felt so unprepared in his entire life. His eyes swept over the well-stocked shelves, filled with gourmet foods and sophisticated drinks. Nothing seemed suitable for frightened little kids. Opting for the safest choice, he returned with 2 glasses of water. The twins were exactly where he had left them, like 2 statues on a couch far too big for them. Their wide eyes followed his every move. "Here," offered Thomas, holding out the glasses. The girls took them mechanically, but they didn't drink. Their gazes remained fixed on some distant point, as if still processing everything that had happened in the last few hours. Thomas sat in an armchair facing them, uncertain of how to proceed. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the ticking of a wall clock and the occasional sound of car horns from the city below. He found himself wishing the girls would say something, cry, do anything besides that eerie silence. "Are you hungry?" he tried again, his voice sounding oddly loud in the stillness of the apartment. Silence. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, feeling utterly lost. He, who ran one of the largest companies in the country and negotiated million-dollar contracts without flinching, now felt completely powerless in the face of 2 4-year-olds. Suddenly, a memory hit him like a punch to the gut. He was 7 years old, sitting alone in the empty kitchen of his run-down apartment, his stomach growling with hunger. His father had left to drink hours earlier, leaving behind only a half-empty package of crackers. Thomas remembered the sense of abandonment, the fear of the unknown, the crushing loneliness. He remembered how he'd wished someone, anyone, would come save him from that nightmare. Opening his eyes, Thomas looked at the twins with a new understanding. They didn't just need food or drink. They needed safety, comfort, the knowledge that they weren't alone in this scary world that had turned upside down. Slowly, he knelt in front of them, getting on their eye level. "Sophie, Claire," he said gently, trying to convey as much reassurance as he could in his voice. "I know you're scared. All this is new and strange. But I want you to know that here, in this apartment, you are completely safe. No one will hurt you. I promise." The girls finally looked him in the eye. Thomas saw a flicker of hope mixed with fear. It was a brief but meaningful moment, as if a small barrier had just come down. "Would you like to see the rest of the house?" Thomas offered, attempting an encouraging smile. He hoped that by moving around, the girls would feel less trapped and afraid. To his surprise, Sophie, who seemed braver than Claire, nodded slightly. It was almost imperceptible, but to Thomas, it felt like the sun had finally broken through a long storm. Thomas showed them around the apartment, room by room, the chef's kitchen with its state-of-the-art appliances, the office lined floor to ceiling with books, the home theater with its giant screen and plush seating. With each new space, Thomas noticed the girls relaxing a bit more, their eyes widening at the city view through the panoramic windows, their small hands timidly touching the decorative objects. When they reached the guest room, with its enormous king-size bed and tasteful decor, Thomas said, "You can sleep here tonight. It's big enough for both of you." Claire, speaking for the first time since entering the apartment, asked in a barely audible whisper, "Can we stay together?" Thomas's heart clenched at the sound of that small, frightened voice. "Oh, of course," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady despite the surge of emotion in him. "You can always stay together." Back in the living room, Thomas grabbed his phone and typed a quick message to Anne. "Need you here. Urgent. Bring clothes and supplies for 2 girls, age 4. While they waited, Thomas tried to start a light-hearted conversation with the twins. He asked about their favorite colors, whether they liked cartoons, anything to get them talking. Slowly, they began to open up, answering his questions with short words. Sophie seemed to be the more talkative of the two, while Claire remained more reserved, always glancing at her sister before responding. Thomas learned that Sophie loved the color pink, and Claire preferred blue. Both enjoyed a cartoon about puppies that performed rescues, something Thomas mentally noted to look up later. These were small details, little crumbs of information, but for Thomas each word was precious, a sign that they were slowly starting to trust him. Half an hour later, the doorbell rang. Thomas opened the door to Anne, his personal assistant, who entered laden with bags. Anne was in her 40s, efficient, discreet, and she'd worked with Thomas for over a decade. She was more than just an assistant. She was his confidant, sometimes his conscience, and one of the few people he trusted implicitly. "Thomas, what's going on?" she asked, her eyes widening when she saw the twins on the couch. Her expression was a mix of confusion and concern. Thomas pulled her aside, explaining the situation briefly. He told her about finding them on the street with Victor and his abusive behavior, and his impulsive decision to bring the girls home. Anne listened, shocked and increasingly worried. "Thomas," she said quietly, glancing nervously at the girls who were curiously watching them from the sofa, "do you realize how illegal this is? Kidnapping is a serious crime, regardless of your intentions." I know," Thomas replied, running his hand through his hair in frustration. "But you didn't see the way that man treated them. I couldn't leave them there. I just couldn't." His voice broke, and Anne saw something in her boss's eyes she rarely witnessed: vulnerability. She knew Thomas's past, the trauma of his childhood. She understood at that moment that this wasn't just an impulsive business decision. It was something deeply personal. Anne sighed, her tone softening. "I understand your motivation, Thomas, but we have to think about the next steps. This could become a legal nightmare if we're not careful." Thomas nodded, grateful for Anne's practical perspective. That's why he trusted her so much. She always kept her feet on the ground even when he lost his way. "You're right. Let's take care of the girls first. Then we'll plan our next move." Anne approached the twins, introducing herself with a warm smile. She pulled pajamas, toothbrushes, a few toys, and other essentials from the bags, items she'd bought in a hurry. "How about a nice warm bath before bed?" Anne suggested, her voice gentle and maternal. The girls looked at Thomas as if asking for permission. He nodded encouragingly, feeling a surge of gratitude that Anne had thought of things that had never even crossed his mind. While Anne helped the twins with their bath, Thomas went out onto the balcony, his head spinning with the day's events. The city stretched out below him, a sea of lights and shadows. Normally, this view calmed him, reminding him of everything he had achieved. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, Thomas felt small in the face of the immense responsibility he had taken on. He knew he had crossed a line, that his actions might have serious consequences. But something inside him, a voice he hadn't heard in years, told him he couldn't have acted any other way. Those girls needed him, just as he had once needed someone who never showed up. An hour later, with the twins clean and dressed in new pajamas, they all met again in the living room. The girls seemed more relaxed, though still cautious. The warm bath and fresh clothes seemed to have worked wonders on their mood. "Are you hungry?" Anne asked, her maternal tone putting the girls more at ease. Sophie and Claire exchanged glances before Sophie timidly responded, "A little." Anne smiled, understanding the understatement. "How about some sandwiches? Maybe some warm milk?" The girls nodded more enthusiastically this time. Anne headed to the kitchen, and Thomas followed her, leaving the twins briefly alone in the living room. "They seem to be adjusting," Anne commented as she prepared the sandwiches. Thomas nodded, watching the girls through the kitchen doorway. They were now curiously examining the toys Anne had brought. "Yes, but we still have a long way to go." Anne sighed, cutting the sandwiches into small triangles. "Thomas, we need to talk about what comes next. We can't just pretend none of this happened." "I know," Thomas replied quietly, determined, "but I can't send them back to that man either. You didn't see how he treated them, Anne. It was like reliving my own nightmare." Anne paused what she was doing, looking directly at Thomas. She rarely saw him so shaken. "I understand, Thomas, but we have to do it the right way, for their safety and yours." Thomas nodded. "You're right, as always. Any suggestions?" "First," Anne said, returning to the sandwiches, "we need to look into these girls' background. Find out who Victor is and if they have other relatives. Maybe there's a grandmother, an uncle, someone who could legally care for them." "Use every resource we have," Thomas agreed. "I want to know everything about them, and that man, criminal record, medical records, anything." Anne nodded. "I'll start first thing in the morning. We also need to consider involving the authorities, Thomas. We can't just keep 2 children here indefinitely without explaining." Thomas frowned, not liking the idea but understanding the necessity. "Agreed, but let's do it carefully. I want as much information as possible before we make that move." They returned to the living room with a tray of sandwiches and a pitcher of milk. The twins, who had been playing quietly with some dolls, looked up with a mix of hunger and apprehension. "Time to eat, girls," Anne said with an encouraging smile. While the girls ate, Thomas and Anne continued their conversation in hushed tones, discussing next steps and possible legal complications. They were so absorbed that they didn't immediately notice when the twins stopped eating and began watching them intently. It was Claire, the quieter of the two, who spoke, her small voice clear. "Victor is not our dad." Silence fell over the room. Thomas and Anne exchanged surprised glances before Thomas knelt down again near the girls. "Can you tell us more about that?" he asked gently, trying not to sound too eager. The twins looked at each other as though silently deciding who should speak. Finally, Sophie took the lead, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "Our mum," she began, hesitantly. "She's gone. It's been a year." Thomas felt his heart tighten. "I'm so sorry," he said softly. "You must miss her very much." Claire nodded, tears forming in her eyes. Sophie continued. "Victor was Mom's boyfriend. When she left, he said he'd take care of us, but he's not nice like she was." Thomas and Anne listened attentively, their hearts heavy with every word. The girls went on, their voices quiet and hesitant at first, but gathering momentum as they spoke. They talked about Victor's frequent yelling, how he left them alone for hours, sometimes days. They spoke of nights spent locked in a room without food, of the constant fear they lived in. "He drinks a lot," Sophie said, her voice trembling, "and when he drinks, he gets really mad." Claire, who had been silent until then, whispered, "Sometimes he hurts us." Thomas felt a wave of anger course through his body. He exchanged a look with Anne, who looked equally horrified. Thomas took a deep breath, trying to control his emotions before speaking. "You were very brave to tell us this," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I want you to know that what Victor did was wrong. Very wrong. And I promise we'll do everything we can to help you." Anne approached, sitting beside the girls on the sofa. "No one will hurt you here," she said, gently placing a hand on each girl's shoulder. "You're safe now." The twins seemed to relax at those words. exhaustion finally catching up to them after the long, turbulent day. Anne noticed this and suggested, "How about we go to bed? Tomorrow is a new day." Thomas agreed, and together he and Anne took the girls to the guest room. Anne helped them brush their teeth and tucked them into the large bed. Thomas stood at the door, watching the scene with a mixture of emotions he could barely name. "Good night, Sophie." "Good night, Claire," he said softly. "If you need anything during the night, just call me. I'll be in the next room." The girls nodded, their eyes already heavy with sleep. In a few minutes, they were sleeping deeply, their small hands still entwined even in slumber. Back in the living room, Thomas and Anne sat, the weight of the situation settling over them. "This is much worse than we thought," Anne said, her voice full of concern. Thomas nodded, his face set with determination. "But now we have more reason to act. We can't let them go back to that man. Ever." "What are we going to do?" Anne asked. "We can't just keep them here forever. There are protocols, law." "No," Thomas agreed. "But we can give them a safe home while we settle this legally. I'll hire the best lawyers, use every resource I have. I won't fail these girls, Anne. I can't." Anne recognized that look. It was the same one Thomas had when closing an important deal or facing a seemingly impossible challenge. But this time, there was something more, a near-fierce determination mixed with a vulnerability she rarely saw in him. "You know this won't be easy, right?" Anne said softly. "It will affect your life, your company." "I know," Thomas interrupted, "but for the first time in years, I feel like I'm doing something that truly matters. Something bigger than profits and acquisitions." They spent the next hour outlining a plan. Anne would conduct a thorough investigation into Victor and the girl's background first thing in the morning. Thomas would contact his legal team to understand all possible legal implications and ways forward. Both agreed to keep the situation private for the time being, at least until they had more information. When Anne finally said goodbye, it was already past midnight. Thomas, exhausted but unable to sleep, went to the guest room. He opened the door quietly and watched the twins sleep. In their sleep, their faces were peaceful, free from the fear and anxiety they had shown earlier. Thomas felt a wave of protectiveness so strong it almost overwhelmed him. In that moment, Thomas knew his life had changed irrevocably. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he was certain of one thing: he would do everything in his power to protect these two girls, to give them the childhood he never had, the safety he had so desperately craved as a child. Closing the door softly, Thomas returned to the living room. He picked up his phone and began making calls. The night would be long, but he was determined. The world of Thomas Carter, the relentless billionaire, was about to transform completely. And for the first time in a long time, he felt truly alive, truly driven by a purpose. While the city slept below, Thomas worked tirelessly, preparing for the battle he knew was coming. A battle not for money or power, but for something far more precious. The future of two little girls who, in a matter of hours, had become the center of his world. Thomas was determined, the girls finally safe in their sleep, and an uncertain yet full of possibility future looming on the horizon. The first rays of sun slipped through the gaps in the curtains when Thomas opened his eyes. For a moment, he was disoriented, the memories of the previous night rushing back in a whirlwind. He stood up quickly, his heart pounding as he remembered the two small guests in his apartment. Silently, Thomas walked to the guest room and carefully opened the door. The sight before him made his heart melt. Sophie and Claire were sleeping soundly, their small forms almost lost in the king-size bed. For the first time since he'd met them, their faces looked completely relaxed, free from the fear and anxiety they displayed when awake. Thomas leaned against the doorframe, watching them with a mixture of tenderness and apprehension. The magnitude of his newly assumed responsibility hit him full force. These two children, so small and vulnerable, now depended on him. He, who had always lived for himself and for his business, now had two precious lives in his hands. "What have I gotten myself into?" he murmured, running a hand through his hair. But even as he felt the weight of responsibility, Thomas also experienced a new, strange sense of purpose. For the first time in years, perhaps ever, he felt he was doing something truly important. The soft chime of the doorbell pulled him out of his thoughts. Anne had arrived, punctual as ever. Thomas closed the bedroom door carefully and went to greet his assistant. "Good morning, Thomas." Anne greeted him, carrying a bag of groceries. "How was the night?" "Surprisingly peaceful," Thomas replied, leading her to the kitchen. "The girls slept through the night. They are still asleep, actually." Anne nodded, beginning to unload cereal, fruit and milk from the bag. "That's good. They were probably exhausted, physically and emotionally." Thomas watched Anne move efficiently around the kitchen, preparing breakfast. "Anne, I have to go to the office today. There are things I need to handle personally. Could you—" "Stay with the girls," Anne finished, a compassionate smile on her face. "Of course, Thomas. That's what I'm here for." Thomas breathed a sigh of relief. "Thank you, Anne. I don't know what I'd do without you." Half an hour later, Thomas was ready to leave. He paused once more at the door of the girls' room, watching them for a moment before heading out. Their image, peacefully sleeping, stayed with him the entire ride to the office. At work, Thomas locked himself in his office, instructing his secretary not to disturb him unless absolutely necessary. He called his most trusted contacts, private detectives, investigators, even some former federal agents now working for him. He launched a thorough investigation into Victor and the twins' family situation. The hours passed in a blur of phone calls, emails, and discreet meetings. As the information started to trickle in, Thomas felt his stomach sink. Victor's record was worse than he could have imagined. Multiple charges of domestic violence, police incidents involving drunkenness and disorderly conduct, suspected involvement in drug trafficking, and the most disturbing piece, an inconclusive investigation into the mother's death. Thomas felt bile rise in his throat as he read the reports. How had this man managed to get custody of the twins? Where was the system that was supposed to protect them? He was so engrossed in the documents that he almost missed the phone ringing. It was Anne. "Thomas," her voice sounded tense, almost panicked. "You need to come home. Now." "Anne, what happened?" Thomas was already standing, grabbing his suit jacket. "It's Victor. He's here in the lobby. He's making a scene, demanding to see the girls." "Thomas, he's threatening to call the police." Thomas felt his blood run cold. "I'm on my way. Don't let him upstairs, Anne. Keep the girls safe." The drive home was a blur. Thomas hardly remembered leaving his office or getting into the car. His mind was fixed on one thought: protecting Sophie and Claire. When he arrived at his building, the scene awaiting him was chaotic. Victor, visibly intoxicated, was yelling at the security guards in the lobby. His face was red with anger, and Thomas could smell the alcohol from a distance. "Where are my girls?" Victor shouted. "I know they're here. You can't kidnap them, you filthy rich boy." Thomas took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. He knew he needed to handle this carefully. He approached slowly, the security guards parting to let him through. "Victor," Thomas said, his voice firm but controlled, "we need to talk, but not like this, not in your condition." Victor turned on him, his bloodshot eyes filled with rage and alcohol. "You!" he roared, lunging forward. The guards held him back. "Where are my girls?" "What did you do to them?" "They're safe," Thomas replied, keeping his composure. "And that's how they're going to stay." "You have no right!" Victor screamed, struggling against the guards. "They're mine. I'm calling the police. I'll ruin you." As though summoned by Victor's words, a police car turned the corner, sirens blaring. Thomas felt a mix of relief and apprehension. This complicated matters, but it could also be his chance to expose Victor for who he really was. Two officers got out of the patrol car, approaching cautiously. "What's going on here?" one asked, looking from Thomas to Victor. Victor immediately started shouting, "This man kidnapped my daughters. He stole them from me." Thomas remained composed. "Officers, the situation is complicated. This man," he pointed at Victor, "has been abusive toward two girls under his care. I brought them somewhere safe last night after witnessing one of his violent outbursts against them." The officers exchanged glances. One approached Thomas. "Sir, I understand your intentions may be good, but if what he's saying is true, you can't just take children." "I know," Thomas replied, "and I'm ready to fully cooperate with the authorities, but please check this man's record before you make any decisions. The girls' safety has to be the priority." The other officer was trying to calm Victor, who continued yelling and making threats. "Sir, You need to calm down. We're here to sort this out, but we need your cooperation." While the police tried to control the situation, Thomas used the moment to step aside and make a quick phone call. "Anne," he said as soon as she answered. "The police are here. How are the girls?" Anne's voice was taut. "They heard the shouting, Thomas. They're terrified. They hid in the closet and won't come out." Thomas's heart clenched. "I'm coming upstairs." "Try to calm them down. Tell them it's going to be okay." Turning back to the officers, Thomas spoke. "Officers, the children are in my apartment, but they're extremely frightened right now. May I go up to check on them? I promise I'll come right back to resolve this." The officers exchanged another look, clearly uneasy with the unusual situation. Finally, one nodded. "All right, but come back quickly. We need to get to the bottom of this." Thomas practically sprinted to the elevator, his heart pounding. When the doors opened into his penthouse, he was greeted by an unsettling silence. "Anne," he called, stepping inside. Anne appeared in the hallway, her face pale with worry. "They're in the guest room closet." "I can't get them to come out, Thomas. They're terrified." Thomas nodded, heading to the room. He opened the door slowly, immediately hearing muffled sobs coming from the closet. "Sophie? Claire?" he called softly, moving closer. "It's me, Thomas. It's okay, you can come out." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the closet door creaked open, and two frightened faces stared back at him. Is he going to take us back?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. Thomas felt his heart break. He knelt down in front of the closet, maintaining a safe distance so as not to startle them further. "No," he said with all the conviction he could muster. "I promised I'd protect you, remember? And that's what I'm going to do. No one will hurt you again." Slowly, like two frightened animals, Sophie and Claire crept out of the closet. Thomas opened his arms, and to his surprise and overwhelming emotion, the girls rushed to him, clinging to him as if their lives depended on it. Thomas wrapped them in a tight embrace, feeling their small bodies tremble against him. In that moment, any doubt he might have had about his actions vanished. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he would do anything to keep these children safe. "It's all right," he murmured, stroking their hair. "You're safe. I promise." They stayed like that for a few minutes, until Thomas gently pulled away. "Now, I have to go back downstairs to sort some things out, but Anne will stay with you, okay? And I'll be back soon." The girls nodded reluctantly, still clinging to him. Thomas stood up, exchanging a meaningful look with Anne. "Stay with them. Don't let anyone up, no matter what." Anne nodded, resolute. "You can count on me, Thomas." With one last glance at the twins, Thomas left the apartment, his face set with determination. As the elevator descended, he made another phone call. "John, it's Thomas. I need you to come to my building now. Bring all the documentation you have on this case. And call the legal team. We're going to settle this once and for all." When the elevator doors opened, Thomas was ready for battle. Victor was still shouting. The police looked increasingly annoyed, and a small crowd of onlookers had gathered. Thomas took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and walked into the chaos. The situation was far more complex than he'd initially imagined, but one thing was clear. There was no turning back. He had taken responsibility for Sophie and Claire, and he'd do everything in his power to protect them. The sun was beginning to set over the city, casting long shadows across the street. As Thomas prepared for the confrontation ahead, he knew it would be only the first of many battles, but glancing back at the building where two scared little girls waited for him, Thomas knew every fight would be worth it. Thomas stood in front of the building, the wind ruffling his suit jacket, his eyes fixed on Victor. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, but his resolve was unshakable. The fate of Sophie and Claire, and possibly his own, would be decided in the coming hours. And Thomas was ready to face whatever came next. Thomas loosened his tie and collapsed onto the sofa in his penthouse, exhausted after the confrontation with Victor and the police. Anne entered the room, carrying 2 mugs of strong coffee. "The girls finally fell asleep," she said, handing Thomas a mug. "It was tough calming them down after all that commotion." Thomas nodded, taking a sip. "Thank you, Anne. I don't know what I'd do without you." They sat in silence for a moment, and the weight of recent events hanging in the air. "Thomas," Anne began hesitantly, "we need to talk about what happened today, about what we're going to do next." Thomas sighed, placing his mug on the coffee table. "I know. The situation is a lot more complicated than we initially thought. We have to consider all the options," Anne said, sitting beside him. "Legally and ethically." Thomas closed his eyes, letting his mind wander. Suddenly, a long-forgotten memory surfaced. He was 16, living on the streets after running away from home. He was hungry, cold, and desperate. That was when he met Sarah, a social worker who helped homeless youth. She took him to a shelter, helped him get back into school, and eventually secure a scholarship. "You have potential, Thomas," she once told him. "Don't let your past define your future." Opening his eyes, Thomas looked at Anne. "I can't abandon them, Anne. I can't send them back to that situation." Anne nodded understandingly. "I get it, Thomas. But we have to do it the right way. We can't just keep them here indefinitely." Thomas got up, walking over to the window. The city lights twinkled outside, millions of them against the night sky. What if I use my influence to get temporary custody?" Anne raised her eyebrows. "Is that possible?" "With the right lawyers, maybe?" Thomas said, turning to her. "We can argue the girls are in immediate danger with Victor. With the evidence we have about his violent history, we might have a chance." Anne considered for a moment. "It's risky, Thomas. It might seem like we're abusing the system." "I know," Thomas said, running a hand through his hair. "But if it gives the girls a safe place while we find a permanent solution, it's worth the risk." After more discussion, they reached an agreement. Thomas picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Claire, it's Thomas Carter. Sorry to call so late, but I have an urgent case and need your help." Claire Donovan was one of the most respected family law attorneys in the city. Thomas had known her for years and trusted her discretion and skill. After explaining the situation, Thomas listened carefully as Claire outlined potential legal paths. "It won't be easy, Thomas," Claire said, "but with the evidence you have and the immediate danger to the children, we can try for an emergency temporary custody order. I'll start preparing the documents right away." Thomas thanked her and hung up, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. He knew he was treading into unfamiliar territory, but the alternative, returning the girls to Victor, was unthinkable. Over the following days, while Claire worked on the legal aspects, Thomas and Anne focused on creating a safe, welcoming environment for Sophie and Claire. Slowly, the girls began to open up, their smiles growing more frequent, their eyes losing some of that constant fear. One morning, Thomas walked into the kitchen to find Sophie trying to reach a box of cereal on a high shelf. "Hey, let me help you with that," he said, grabbing the box for her. Sophie looked at him, a small smile forming on her lips. "Thanks, Thomas." It was a simple moment, but a significant one. Thomas felt his heart warm at the growing trust in the girl. Claire was also adjusting, though she remained the quieter of the two. Thomas frequently caught her watching him with curiosity, as though trying to figure something out. One evening, as Thomas read a bedtime story, Claire asked timidly, "Will you be our new dad?" The question took Thomas by surprise. He looked at the hopeful faces of the twins and felt a lump in his throat. I don't know exactly what's going to happen, Claire, but I promise that no matter what, I'll always be here for both of you." The girls seemed satisfied with his answer, snuggling closer as he continued the story. The next day, Thomas received a call from Claire Donovan. "We have a hearing scheduled for next week, Thomas. The judge will consider our request for temporary custody." Thomas thanked her. Feeling a mix of anxiety and resolve, he knew the battle was just beginning. As he prepared to leave the office that afternoon, his secretary entered, looking nervous. "Mr. Carter, there's a note for you." She handed him a plain envelope with no return address. Thomas opened it, feeling a chill as he read its contents. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. Give the girls back or suffer the consequences." There was no signature, but Thomas knew exactly who it was from. Victor was escalating the situation, and Thomas knew things were about to get much more complicated. Crumpling the paper in his hand, Thomas looked out his office window. determination burning in his eyes. He would not back down, especially not now, not when Sophie and Claire were finally beginning to feel safe. The sun set over the city, casting a golden glow across the skyscrapers. Thomas knew the coming days would be crucial. Every decision he made now would shape not only his future, but also that of two small girls who had unexpectedly become the center of his world. With one last glance at the city below, Thomas grabbed his suit jacket and left the office. He had two girls waiting for him at home and a legal battle ahead of him, and he was ready to face both head-on. Claire Donovan sat in her office, surrounded by piles of documents and an open laptop. She had spent the last few days fully immersed in investigating the twins' family background and Victor's history. Each new discovery disturbed her more and fueled her determination to help Thomas protect the girls. She picked up the phone and dialed Thomas's number. "Thomas, I've got some information you need to hear," she said the moment he answered. On the other end of the line, Thomas straightened in his chair. "What did you find out, Claire?" "The twins' family history is complicated, to say the least," Claire began. "Their mother, Sarah Thompson, died a year ago under suspicious circumstances. The case was filed as an accidental overdose, but the police report has inconsistencies." Thomas felt a knot in his stomach. "And what about Victor?" Claire sighed heavily. "Victor Reeves. He has a criminal record dating back to his teens. Petty theft at first, then moving on to more serious crimes. He met Sarah when they were both in a rehabilitation program." As Claire continued detailing her findings, Thomas found himself torn between the need to focus on the case and the growing demands of his business. Over the past few days, his dedication to the twins' situation had started to affect his company. Important meetings were postponed, crucial decisions left in limbo. "Mr. Carter," his secretary interrupted, entering his office, "the board is waiting for you in the conference room. They're impatient." Thomas nodded, feeling pulled in multiple directions. "Claire, I have to go. Can we continue this later?" "Of course, Thomas. I'll keep investigating and let you know what I find," Claire said. Thomas hung up and headed to the conference room, where he was met with disapproving looks from the board members. "Thomas," began Marcus Blackwell, the longest-serving board member, "we understand you're dealing with personal matters, but the company can't be put on hold. Shareholders are starting to ask questions." Thomas took a deep breath, bracing himself for a long and difficult meeting. He knew he had to find a balance between his corporate responsibilities and his commitment to the twins. But right now, with Claire's revelations fresh in his mind, it was hard to concentrate on charts and financial projections. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, Anne was conducting her own investigation. She had gained access to police records through a few contacts, and what she found horrified her. Victor wasn't just a small-time criminal. His record included armed robbery, extortion, and even suspicions of involvement in a drug trafficking ring. Anne wondered how someone with such an extensive history had managed to secure custody of the twins. Back at Thomas's apartment, Sophie and Claire were experiencing a rare moment of relaxation, playing with some dolls that Anne had bought for them. Thomas walked in, tired from the long board meeting, but his face lit up at the sight of the girls smiling. "Hey girls," he said, sitting on the floor beside them. "Looks like fun. Can I join you?" Sophie nodded enthusiastically, handing him a doll. As they played, Thomas noticed that the girls seemed more at ease, more willing to talk. "You know," Sophie began hesitantly, "sometimes Victor took us on outings." Thomas felt his heart race, but kept his voice calm. "What kind of outing, Sophie?" Claire, who had been quietly playing with a doll, looked up. "They were secret outings," she said softly. "Victor said we couldn't tell anyone." Thomas exchanged a worried glance with Anne, who had just come into the room. He knew he had to tread carefully. He didn't want to push the girls too hard, but he also sensed there was more to the story than they were letting on. "Do you remember where you went on these outings?" he asked gently. The twins looked at each other, as if deciding how much they could reveal. Finally, Sophie spoke. "Sometimes we went to stores. Victor said we were playing hide-and-seek." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He had a terrible suspicion about what these outings were, but he didn't want to believe it. At that moment, Thomas's phone rang. It was Claire Donovan again. "Thomas, you need to see this," she said urgently. "I got access to some surveillance footage. It's disturbing." Minutes later, Thomas was in his home office, staring intently at his computer screen. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. Victor, with Sophie and Claire by his side, entering a department store. The girls looked nervous, constantly glancing around. Then, while Victor distracted an employee, the twins slipped small items into their backpacks. Thomas felt his stomach churn. Victor hadn't just been emotionally abusing the girls, he'd been using them to commit crimes. "My God," Claire murmured, watching the video with him via video call. "This changes everything, Thomas. We have to notify the authorities immediately." Thomas nodded, feeling a mix of rage and guilt. How had he not realized the extent of the abuse sooner? How many other things had the girls been forced to do? In the days that followed, the investigation took an official turn. The police were informed, and a special unit was assigned to the case. Thomas cooperated fully, providing all the evidence he and his team had gathered. The twins, feeling increasingly safe with Thomas and Anne, started revealing more details about their involuntary involvement in Victor's crimes. They talked about how he threatened them, saying that if they didn't help him, he would send them back to the bad place, which Thomas discovered was a reference to the foster system they had briefly experienced after their mother's death. Each new revelation tore at Thomas's heart. He found himself waking in the middle of the night, tormented by nightmares in which he failed to save the girls. The guilt over not recognizing the extent of the abuse earlier ate at him, but he channeled those feelings into a fierce determination to do the right thing. "We can't change the past," Anne told him one night, seeing his anguish, "but we can shape their future. That's what we need to focus on." Thomas knew she was right. He intensified his efforts, working tirelessly with Claire to build a solid case. He poured all his influence and resources into ensuring Victor faced justice and the twins remained safe. Meanwhile, the police prepared an operation to capture Victor. Based on the information provided by Thomas and the twins' revelations, they mapped the places Victor frequented and his likely hideouts. On the eve of the planned operation, Thomas sat down with Sophie and Claire. The girls had come a long way in recent weeks, but he could still see the fear in their eyes when Victor's name was mentioned. "I want you to know," Thomas said, gently holding their hands, "that you're safe now. What happened to you wasn't your fault. Victor did very bad things, and he's going to pay for them." Sophie looked at Thomas with wide eyes. "He won't take us back?" Thomas felt his heart squeeze. "No, sweetheart. He'll never hurt you again." "I promise." Claire, usually the quieter one, surprised Thomas by throwing her arms around him, sobbing. "Thank you, Thomas," she murmured between tears. That night, after the girls finally fell asleep, Thomas stood on his balcony, looking out at the city. Tomorrow, the police would carry out the operation to arrest Victor. It was the beginning of the end of a dark chapter in the twins' lives, but Thomas knew the road ahead would still be long and difficult. His phone buzzed with a message from Claire. "Everything's set for tomorrow. The police are confident. Keep the girls safe." Thomas took one last look at the city lights shining against the night sky. He would do more than just keep the girls safe. He would give them a future, a chance to be children again, and nothing, not Victor or the legal challenges sure to arise, would stop him. With a final glance toward the room where Sophie and Claire slept peacefully, Thomas steeled himself for the battle to come. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a spark of hope. Justice was on its way, and with it, the promise of a new beginning for two little girls who had stolen his heart. Morning dawned grey and cold, as if the sky itself reflected the tension in the air. Thomas adjusted the discreet earpiece in his ear, his heart pounding against his chest. On the other end of the line, Detective Rodriguez's calm voice offered reassurance. "Everything's set, Mr. Carter. Our teams are in position. Remember, your safety is our priority. At the first sign of danger, get out immediately." Thomas nodded, even though Rodriguez couldn't see him. He was inside a department store in the city center, pretending to be an ordinary customer. But this was no ordinary store today. Every shelf, corner, and fitting room had been equipped with hidden cameras. Undercover officers posed as employees and shoppers throughout the building. The trap was set. Now they just had to wait for Victor to take the bait. The hours dragged on. Thomas wandered the aisles, feigning interest in random items, always on alert. His mind drifted to Sophie and Claire, safe at home with Anne. He hadn't told them about the operation. He didn't want to frighten them any more than necessary. It was mid-afternoon when the atmosphere shifted subtly. Thomas felt it before he saw it. A tense hush fell over the store, like the heavy air before a storm. "He's here," Rodriguez whispered in Thomas's ear. "Stay calm and act normal." Thomas slowly turned, pretending to examine a bookshelf. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Victor enter. The man looked jittery, his eyes darting around, searching for security cameras or guards. Thomas felt a surge of anger at the sight of the man who had caused the twins so much pain, but he forced himself to remain impassive. Victor began his usual routine, picking up items, pretending to be interested, then slipping them discreetly into an inside pocket. Thomas watched, feeling sick, remembering how he used Sophie and Claire for these very thefts. Minutes stretched into hours. Victor continued his shopping, pocketing more and more items. Thomas could feel the tension building, knowing the police were just waiting for the right moment to act. Suddenly, everything happened quickly. Victor must have sensed something was off because he started moving rapidly toward the exit. That's when Rodriguez's voice boomed. "Police! Freeze!" Chaos erupted. Customers screamed, some running to hide, others trying to see what was happening. Victor, caught off guard, tried to run but was quickly surrounded by officers shedding their disguises. Thomas watched, heart in his throat, as Victor was tackled and handcuffed. The man shouted and struggled, his face contorted with rage and fear. "This is a mistake. How you can't arrest me? I have rights." But his words fell on deaf ears. The evidence was overwhelming. The stolen items were pulled from his pockets. The cameras had captured everything. Detective Rodriguez approached Thomas, a slight smile of satisfaction on his face. "We got him, Mr. Carter. Victor Reeves is in custody." Thomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was a relief, yes, but also the start of a new wave of worries. "Now what?" he asked the detective. "Now the legal process begins," Rodriguez replied. "We'll need the girl's testimony at some point, but we'll handle it as sensitively as possible." Thomas felt his stomach drop. The twins. How would he explain all this to them? How could he protect them from the stress and trauma of legal proceedings? As he was escorted out of the store, passing reporters already flocking to the entrance, Thomas could only think of Sophie and Claire. The news of Victor's arrest would spread quickly. He had to get home before the girls found out some other way. The drive home was a blur. Thomas barely remembered getting into his car or instructing the driver. His mind was focused on how to approach the situation with the twins. When he got home, he found Anne in the living room, a worried look on her face. "They saw it on TV," Anne said before Thomas could speak. "It's all over the news." Thomas felt his heart sink. He'd wanted to be the one to tell the girls, to break it to them gently. "Where are they?" he asked, his voice low and tense. Anne pointed to the girls' room. "In there. They locked themselves in as soon as they saw the news. They're scared, Thomas." Thomas walked slowly to the bedroom door, heart heavy. He could hear muffled sobs from inside. He knocked softly. "Sophie. Claire. It's me, Thomas. May I come in?" There was a moment of silence, then the sound of light footsteps. The door opened a crack, and Thomas saw Sophie's tear-stained face peeking out. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice trembling. "They caught Victor." Thomas nodded gently. "Yes, sweetheart, it's true. Victor's been arrested. He can't hurt you now." The door opened wider, and Thomas saw Claire curled up on the bed, clutching a teddy bear tightly. He entered the room slowly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I know this is scary," he began softly, "but I want you to know that you're safe. No one's going to take you away." Claire looked up, her eyes filled with fear. "But what if he escapes? What if he comes after us?" Thomas felt his heart ache. He wanted to promise them it would never happen, but he couldn't make guarantees he wasn't sure he could keep. "Victor is in custody now," he explained carefully. "There are many people working to make sure he can't hurt anyone ever again. And I promise, I'll do everything I can to keep you safe. Sophie approached, sitting next to Thomas. Are we going to have to talk to the police? Thomas hesitated. He knew that eventually the girls would need to give statements, but he wanted to protect them from as much stress as possible. Maybe, he answered honestly. But if that happens, I'll be with you the whole time, and we'll make sure it's as comfortable as it can be. The twins exchanged glances, and to Thomas's surprise, they both moved closer to him, seeking comfort in his presence. You're both very brave, Thomas said, wrapping them in a gentle hug, and I'm so proud of you. We'll get through this together, okay? The girls nodded, still scared but visibly calmer. Thomas knew the days ahead would be tough. There would be statements, possible hearings, and all the emotional turmoil that comes with closing such a painful chapter in their lives. But looking at Sophie and Claire, seeing the trust they placed in him, Thomas knew he'd do anything to protect them. The legal battle was just beginning, but he was prepared to face every challenge that came their way. As the sun set outside, casting long shadows across the room, Thomas stayed with the twins, offering the comfort and security they so desperately needed. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but in that moment, in that room, there was a small bubble of peace, and Thomas was determined to do everything in his power to preserve it. Dr. Melissa Winters's office was an oasis of calm amid the turmoil that Thomas's and the twins' lives had become. The walls were painted a soothing shade of blue, shelves lined with children's books, and carefully arranged toys created a welcoming, safe environment. Thomas watched anxiously through the one-way observation window as Sophie and Claire settled onto the plush rug, surrounded by dolls and colorful blocks. Dr. Winters, a highly recommended child therapist, sat with them, her gentle voice and gestures immediately putting the girls at ease. They'll be fine, Anne said, placing a reassuring hand on Thomas's shoulder. Dr. Winters is the best at what she does. Thomas nodded, unable to tear his eyes away from the twins. In the weeks since Victor's arrest, he had devoted himself completely to ensuring Sophie and Claire received the best possible care. Intensive therapy was just one part of it. Working closely with social workers, Thomas had created a comprehensive support network for the girls, art classes for emotional expression, music therapy sessions, and even an equine therapy program. Everything designed to help them process their trauma and start to heal. But the path to recovery was long and often painful. Nights were particularly difficult, with both girls suffering frequent nightmares. Thomas lost count of how many times he woke up to muffled cries, rushing to their room to comfort them, reminding them they were safe. "Victor can't get us," Claire repeatedly asked, her eyes wide with fear in the darkness. "No, sweetheart," Thomas would reply each time, holding her gently. "Victor's gone and he can't hurt you, I promise." While the twins grappled with their inner demons, Thomas fought his own battles. The legal proceedings against Victor were in full swing, and Thomas found himself at the center of a media storm. His decision to testify against Victor drew national attention, with tabloids having a field day with the billionaire hero who saved 2 children from a cruel monster. The pressure was immense. Thomas spent his days alternating between meetings with lawyers, court preparation sessions, and tending to the girls' emotional needs. His nights were filled with endless research on childhood trauma and recovery methods. But amid the chaos, there were moments of light, like when Sophie, for the first time since arriving, laughed openly during a painting session, flinging paint on her face in a burst of joy. Or when Claire, always the quieter one, finally opened up during a therapy session, talking about her fears and hopes. These moments, however brief, gave Thomas the strength to keep going. He collected them like treasures, recalling them during the darkest moments. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling meeting with his legal team, Thomas came home to find the girls in the mansion's garden, playing with a dog Anne had brought from a local shelter. The sound of their laughter, mixed with the dog's excited barks, stopped Thomas in his tracks. "They look happy," he said softly to Anne, who watched the scene beside him. Anne smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "They're beginning to heal, Thomas, thanks to you." It was at that moment Thomas made a decision that would change his life forever. He could not, would not, let Sophie and Claire end up back in the foster system. The thought of separating them or sending them into the unknown was unbearable. "Anne," he said, his voice filled with newfound resolve, "I need you to contact our lawyers. I want to start the adoption process." Anne looked at him in surprise, but a smile spread across her face. "Are you sure, Thomas? It's a huge step." Thomas watched the twins playing, their faces lit up with a happiness he once thought impossible. "I've never been so sure of anything in my life." The following days were a whirlwind of emotion. As Thomas navigated the complex adoption process, the twins continued on their healing journey. There were ups and downs, days of progress followed by sudden regressions, but gradually the wounds began to heal. It was in the midst of this turmoil that the unexpected happened. Thomas was in his home office, reviewing adoption documents, when his phone rang. It was Victor's lawyer. "Mr. Carter," came the voice on the other line. "I have an unusual request. Victor wants to talk to you. He's asking for a prison visit." Thomas felt as though he'd been punched in the gut. Victor, the man who had caused such suffering, who had stolen Sophie and Claire's childhood. What could he possibly want? "Why?" Thomas managed to ask, his voice steadier than he felt. "He says he has important information about the case, information that could affect the girl's future." Thomas hung up, his mind racing. Should he grant Victor's request? What information could he have? More importantly, how would this affect Sophie and Claire? He spent the next few days in internal debate, consulting his legal team and, most importantly, talking to Dr. Winters about the potential psychological impact on the twins. "It's a tough decision, Thomas," Dr. Winters said during one of his own therapy sessions. He had decided to seek help to manage the emotional turmoil. On the one hand, any contact with Victor can be traumatic for the girls, even if it's indirect. On the other hand, if he truly has important information, it could be beneficial for their long-term healing. After much reflection and counsel, Thomas made his decision. He would visit Victor, but under strict conditions. The visit would be monitored, limited in time, and Thomas would have the power to end it at any moment. The day of the visit arrived, cold and grey, mirroring the emotional storm inside Thomas. He stood outside the gates of the state prison, his heart pounding. "You don't have to do this," Anne said, insisting on accompanying him. Thomas took a deep breath. "Yes, I do, for the girls." The visiting room was sterile and impersonal, security cameras eyeing every corner. When Victor was brought in, Thomas almost didn't recognize him. The once threatening man now looked beaten down, with hollow eyes and a slumped posture. "Mr. Carter?" Victor said, his voice hoarse. "Thank you for coming." Thomas didn't answer right away, studying the man in front of him. There was something different about Victor, beyond the physical changes. "Why did you want to see me, Victor?" Thomas finally asked, and his voice controlled. Victor lowered his gaze, his cuffed hands shaking slightly. I need to confess something. Something about the girl's mother. About Sarah." Thomas felt his heart race. "What about Sarah?" Victor took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "Her death wasn't an accidental overdose, like everyone thought." Time seemed to stop for Thomas. He leaned forward, every fiber of his being focused on Victor's next words. "It was an accident," Victor went on, his voice cracking. "We were arguing. I was drunk as usual. She threatened to leave me, to take the girls. I pushed her. She fell, hit her head. When I realized what I'd done..." Victor trailed off, tears streaming down his face. Thomas felt a clash of emotions, anger, disgust, yet a hint of pity. "Why are you telling me this now?" Thomas asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. Victor looked up, his eyes filled with a shame and regret Thomas had never seen in him. "Because the girls deserve to know the truth. Because I blamed them, Thomas. I told them it was their fault their mother died. I used that to control them, to keep them quiet about everything." Thomas felt a wave of nausea. The cruelty of that manipulation was almost unimaginable. "How could you?" he whispered, anger simmering beneath the surface. "I was scared," Victor replied, his voice barely audible. "Scared of going to prison, scared of losing the girls. They were all I had left of Sarah. But I messed everything up. I hurt them in ways I'll never be able to fix." Victor looked Thomas in the eye, a painful sincerity there. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I'll probably spend the rest of my life in prison. But the girls, they deserve to know the truth. They deserve a chance to really heal, to move on without that lie. I just want them to know I'm sorry, more than I can ever say." Thomas stayed silent for a long moment, processing all he'd heard. Part of him wanted to scream at Victor, to make him pay for every tear Sophie and Claire had shed. But another part, one that surprised him, felt a twinge of compassion for the broken man before him. "What do you expect me to do with this information, Victor?" Thomas finally asked. Victor shrugged, looking smaller than ever. "Whatever you think is best for the girls, they deserve a real chance at healing, without carrying guilt that isn't theirs. I just want them to know I'm sorry." The visit ended soon after, leaving Thomas emotionally drained and deeply unsettled. Walking back to the car where Anne waited, his mind swirled with the implications of what he'd just learned. How would he tell the twins? Should he tell them? Would this truth help them heal or just reopen old wounds? Anne immediately noticed his agitated state. "Thomas, what happened in there?" Thomas looked at her, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Anne, things just got a lot more complicated." As the car pulled away from the prison, Thomas stared out the window, watching the scenery blur by. He knew the decisions he made in the coming days would shape not only his future, but Sophie and Claire's as well. Their healing process had begun, but Thomas realized the journey was far from over. A path filled with painful truths and difficult decisions lay ahead, but hopefully, it also held the promise of a new beginning. With a deep sigh, Thomas closed his eyes, allowing himself a moment of vulnerability before returning home to the two little girls who had become the center of his world. The future was uncertain, but he was sure of one thing. He would do everything in his power to ensure Sophie and Claire had the chance for a happy, healthy life, free from the ghosts of the past. Thomas sat in his home office, his hands trembling slightly around a mug of coffee gone cold. Anne and Claire, his attorney, watched him with concerned expressions. "So," Anne began, breaking the tense silence, "Victor confessed that Sarah's death was an accident, not an overdose." Thomas nodded, his voice gravelly as he spoke. "Yes, and there's more. He admitted to using Sarah's death to manipulate the girls, told them it was their fault." Claire let out a shocked sigh. "My God, that's horrible. Those poor kid." "The question now," Thomas said, looking at both women, "is how we handle this. Do we tell the girls?" A heated debate followed. Anne argued that the twins had a right to know the truth about their mother, that it could help free them from the guilt they carried. Claire, on the other hand, worried about the emotional impact of such a revelation. "They've already been through so much trauma," Claire reasoned. "Would revealing this now be too much for them to handle?" Thomas listened carefully, his heart heavy with responsibility. At last, he spoke. "I think we need Dr. Winters's professional opinion on this." In the days that followed, Thomas worked closely with Dr. Winters to develop the best approach. They decided the truth should be told, but cautiously and in a controlled environment. The day of the revelation arrived, bringing a mix of anxiety and hope. Thomas found himself in Dr. Winters's family therapy room, with Sophie and Claire seated on a sofa across from him, their small hands linked. "Girls," Thomas began gently, "remember when we talked about how sometimes adults make mistakes, but it's important to be honest?" The twins nodded, their big eyes fixed on him. "Well, I recently learned some things about your mom and Victor, and I believe it's important for you to know the truth." With carefully chosen words and Dr. Winters's gentle guidance, Thomas recounted what Victor had confessed. He watched the girls' reactions intently, ready to stop if it became too overwhelming. When he finished, the silence in the room was palpable. Sophie was the first to speak, her voice quivering slightly. "So it wasn't our fault that Mom died?" "No, sweetheart," Thomas replied, feeling his heart tighten. "It was never your fault." Claire, who had stayed silent, suddenly burst into tears. "But Victor said, he said if we hadn't made noise that night." Thomas moved to the sofa quickly, wrapping the girls in a tight hug. "Victor lied to you," he said softly but firmly. "He was scared and did something very wrong. But you, my sweet girls, you did nothing wrong. Dr. Winters stepped in gently, guiding the conversation to help the twins express their emotions. She encouraged them to voice their feelings, ask questions, and release the guilt they had been carrying for so long. The next few hours were an emotional roller coaster. There were moments of intense crying, anger, and confusion. But there were also moments of palpable relief, like a huge weight being lifted from the twins' tiny shoulders. Thomas stayed by their side the entire time, offering comfort, answering questions, and reaffirming his love and commitment. "No matter what happens," he said, looking into each girl's eyes, "I'll always be here for you. Always." By the end of the session, Thomas noticed a subtle change in the twins. Their eyes, though still red from crying, looked clearer, as if a fog had lifted. Sophie gazed at Thomas, a question in her eyes. "Thomas, do you still want to be our dad? Even after knowing all this?" Thomas felt his heart swell with love. He knelt before them, taking their hands in his. "Sophie, Claire, nothing in this world could make me want anything else. You are the bravest, most incredible girls I've ever known. It would be the greatest honor of my life to be your dad." The girls flung themselves into his arms, and Thomas hugged them tightly, feeling an unbreakable bond forming. In that moment, he knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together as a family. When they finally left the therapy room, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the city. Thomas held the twins' hands as they walked to the car, feeling like they were taking their first steps on a new journey. "Where are we going now?" Claire asked, her voice small but with a note of hope Thomas hadn't heard before. Thomas smiled, feeling a wave of love and protection. "We're going home," he said simply. "Let's go home." And so, hand in hand, Thomas, Sophie, and Claire walked toward the future, united by the truth and by the love they had found in each other. The path ahead would still hold challenges, but now they would face them together, free from past secrets and full of hope for tomorrow. The weeks that followed the revelation of the truth about Sarah's death were intense and emotionally draining for everyone. Sophie and Claire threw themselves into intensive therapy sessions with Dr. Winters, working hard to process not just the truth about their mother, but also all the trauma they had endured under Victor's care. Thomas watched with both sorrow and pride as the twins bravely confronted their fears and painful memories. There were tough days when the girls refused to get out of bed, tormented by nightmares and flashbacks. In those moments, Thomas was there, offering silent comfort, reassuring hugs, and words of encouragement. "You are the strongest girls I've ever met," he would say, sitting on the edge of their bed on a particularly bad night. "And I'm so proud of you." Determined to create the safest, most welcoming environment possible, Thomas worked tirelessly. He converted one of the mansion's rooms into a therapy space, filled with games, art supplies, and cozy corners for when the girls needed a moment of calm. Anne, always perceptive, suggested establishing a stable routine. "Children who've experienced trauma need predictability," she explained. So Thomas set regular schedules for meals, activities, and even family bonding time. Slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible at first, the twins began to show signs of recovery. The first genuine smile from Claire during a painting session was like a sunbeam after a long storm. The day Sophie asked to go to the park, once a terrifying prospect for her, was a victory everyone celebrated. Thomas found himself marveling at these small changes. The sound of the girls' laughter echoing through the once quiet mansion was music to his ears. Watching them run around the garden, blowing soap bubbles or building sandcastles, made his heart swell in a way he'd never felt before. Yet, as the twins progressed on their healing journey, Thomas grappled with his own complex emotions. The anger he felt toward Victor sometimes overwhelmed him, threatening to consume him. Other times, he was surprised to feel a twinge of pity for the man who, in his own twisted way, may have cared about the girls. "It's normal to have conflicting feelings," Dr. Winters reassured him during one of his own therapy sessions. Thomas had decided to seek help to navigate the whirlwind of emotions he was experiencing. What's important is not letting those feelings negatively affect your relationship with the girls. As Victor's final trial drew nearer, a fresh wave of anxiety swept through the household. Thomas worried constantly about the toll the process would take on Sophie and Claire. He collaborated closely with the legal team and Dr. Winters to minimize the girls' involvement, protecting them as much as possible from the stress of the trial. During this tense period, Thomas had an epiphany. Late one night in his office, poring over legal documents, he was struck by the enormity of the child abuse and neglect problem. "How many other Sophies and Claires are out there?" he murmured, feeling a weight in his chest. The next morning, Thomas called a meeting with his executive team. "I want to create a foundation," he announced, his voice firm with determination. "A foundation dedicated to helping children who've experienced abuse and neglect." Over the following days, Thomas threw himself into planning the foundation with the same intensity he devoted to his most significant business ventures. He envisioned an organization that not only provided therapeutic support, but also worked to change policies, educate the public, and offer resources to at-risk families. The twins were thrilled when they heard about the project. "We can help other kids like us?" Sophie asked, her eyes shining with a mix of hope and empathy that made Thomas's heart clench. "Of course you can, sweetheart," he replied, hugging her. "You'll be the inspiration for it all." As summer turned to fall, Thomas found himself reflecting on how drastically his life had changed since meeting Sophie and Claire. Sitting on his veranda, watching the girls playing among the golden leaves in the yard, he could hardly believe the transformation. The man who once lived solely for business, measuring success by dollars and deals, now found his greatest joy in two little girls' smiles. The cold, impersonal penthouse he once called home was now filled with life, laughter, and, yes, occasional chaos. Thomas smiled as he watched Sophie trying to teach Claire how to do a cartwheel, their laughter echoing through the crisp autumn air as they both tumbled into a pile of leaves. He thought back to just months ago, when these same girls could barely smile, terrified of the world around them. The road to healing was far from over. Thomas knew there would be more challenges. Victor's trial, the adoption process, the inevitable ups and downs of raising two children who had been through so much. But seeing the joy on Sophie's and Claire's faces, the confidence in their steps, he knew every challenge would be worth it. At that moment, as if sensing his gaze, the girls turned and waved, their smiles lighting up the autumn garden. "Come play with us, Thomas," Claire shouted, her voice filled with a happiness that once seemed impossible. Thomas didn't hesitate. Standing, he ran toward the girls, his heart light and full of love. As he dove into the pile of leaves with Sophie and Claire, their laughter mingling in the crisp fall air, Thomas knew with absolute certainty this was the life he was meant to lead. The sun began to set, bathing the garden in golden light. Thomas hugged the girls, a wave of gratitude washing over him. The path to healing was long, sometimes painful, but looking at Sophie and Claire's beaming faces, he knew they were on the right track. "Thank you," he whispered, more to himself than to the girls. "For what?" Sophie asked, curious. Thomas smiled, his eyes shining with emotion. "For teaching me the true meaning of family." And so, as the day came to an end, Thomas, Sophie, and Claire remained in the garden, united not just by love, but by the healing journey they had embarked on together. The future, with all its challenges and possibilities, awaited. But for now, in that perfect moment, they were exactly where they needed to be, together, healing, and filled with hope for tomorrow. The courtroom was packed on the day of Victor's trial. Thomas straightened his tie, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He glanced back at Anne, seated with Sophie and Claire. Dressed in their best clothes, the twins looked so small and vulnerable in the expansive courtroom. "Everything will be fine," Thomas murmured to them before heading to the witness stand. As he gave his testimony, Thomas kept his eyes on the judge, avoiding looking at Victor. He recounted in detail the night he found the girls, the abuse they had suffered, and the subsequent revelations about Sarah's death. "These girls," Thomas concluded, his voice thick with emotion, "deserve the chance at a normal life, free from the fear and guilt that were wrongly placed upon them." When Victor took the stand, Thomas finally allowed himself to look at the man. What he saw surprised him. Victor appeared older, defeated, his eyes carrying a heaviness Thomas hadn't noticed before. I did terrible things," Victor began, his voice trembling. "I hurt the people I should have protected. Sophie, Claire, I'm sorry. More than words can say. As Victor continued his testimony, admitting his crimes and expressing remorse, Thomas felt a complex mix of emotions, anger at all the girls had endured, yes, but also a flicker of compassion for the broken man before him. After several days of testimony and deliberation, the verdict was announced. Victor was found guilty on all charges. When the sentence was read, 25 years in prison with no chance of parole, Victor simply nodded, accepting his fate. Before being led away, Victor looked directly at Thomas. "Take care of them," he said quietly. "Give them the love I never could." Thomas nodded solemnly, feeling the weight of the moment. This was the end of a painful chapter and the beginning of something new. In the weeks following the trial, Thomas threw himself into the adoption process. Piles of paperwork, interviews with social workers, and endless meetings with lawyers filled his days. "Are you sure about this, Thomas?" Anne asked one evening, finding him hunched over another set of forms. "It's a huge responsibility." Thomas looked up at her, a tired but determined smile on his face. "I've never been more sure of anything, Anne." Finally, after months of anxiety and anticipation, the day Thomas had long awaited arrived. Standing before the judge and with Sophie and Claire by his side, he heard the words that changed everything. "It is with great pleasure that I declare Sophie and Claire officially adopted by Thomas Carter. Congratulations to your new family." The girls squealed with delight, throwing themselves into Thomas's arms. Tears streamed freely down his face as he hugged his daughters, feeling as though his heart might burst with happiness. The months that followed were a whirlwind of adjustments and discoveries. Thomas, used to running massive corporations, now found himself learning how to braid hair, mediate disputes over the last cookie, and balance business meetings with bedtime stories. But every challenge brought immeasurable rewards. Seeing Sophie's eyes light up as she mastered riding a bike without training wheels, hearing Claire's carefree laugh as she played with her new school friends, those moments made it all worthwhile. The foundation Thomas had created, New Beginnings, grew quickly. Combining his business expertise with his newfound perspective as an adoptive father, Thomas was making a real difference in the lives of traumatized children nationwide. "Dad, look!" Sophie exclaimed one day, running to Thomas with a drawing. It showed 3 stick figures, one large, 2 small, all holding hands and smiling. "It's us!" Thomas felt his heart overflow with love. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," he said, hugging her. "We'll put it on the fridge for everyone to see." As the seasons passed, Thomas watched in awe as his daughters blossomed. Sophie, once so timid, now shone in her school ballet recitals. Claire, who had nightly terrors, now slept peacefully, her dreams filled with adventures and possibilities. It wasn't always easy. There were days when memories of the past haunted the girls, days when Thomas felt overwhelmed balancing corporate life with fatherhood. But they supported each other through it all, reminding each other how far they had come. On a bright spring afternoon, Thomas surprised the girls with a picnic in the park. While preparing the basket, he reflected on how far they had traveled on this journey. At the park, Thomas spread a large blanket under a leafy tree. Sophie and Claire ran across the grass, their laughter echoing in the air. Watching them, Thomas felt a surge of gratitude so strong it nearly knocked him over. "Girls," he called, "time to eat." The twins rushed back, their faces pink with excitement. As they devoured sandwiches and fruit, they talked excitedly about their plans for the summer, their hopes and dreams. "What about you, Dad?" Claire asked suddenly. "What's your dream?" Thomas looked at his daughters, his heart brimming with love. "My dream," he smiled, pulling them into a hug. "I'm living it right now." The girls giggled, snuggling closer. The sun began to set, bathing the park in a golden glow. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, taking in the peace and joy of that perfect moment. He thought of all they had been through, the pain, fear, and uncertainty. But he also thought of the healing, the love, and the hope they had found together. Thomas knew the road ahead would still have its challenges, but looking at Sophie and Claire, he was sure they could face anything. "How about some ice cream before we go home?" Thomas suggested, grinning as he saw the twins' eyes light up with excitement. Walking hand in hand toward the ice cream cart, Thomas felt a deep sense of contentment. This was his place in the world, beside these two extraordinary girls who had transformed his life in unimaginable ways. Finally, the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Thomas, Sophie, and Claire stayed in the park a bit longer, savoring their ice cream and the precious moment they shared. It was more than just the end of a day. It was a symbol of their new beginning, a promise of brighter days ahead. And so, under the twilight sky, surrounded by the sound of laughter and the sweet smell of summer, Thomas, Sophie, and Claire headed home, not just as a father and daughters, but as a family truly bound by love, courage, and unwavering hope for the future they would build together.